Welcome to LGIU's Fireside Chat, a new interview series for our future local lab. I'm Freya Millard, the Head of Content at LGIU. In this series, we chat with guests from all around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector can do now to start preparing for that future. Joining me today is Professor Lucy Easthope. Lucy is a leading authority on planning for and recovering from disaster. She has been at the forefront of the profession for over 2 decades, with active involvement in the biggest world-shaping disasters from 9/11 to COVID-19, and many others that fall under and off the radar, but not for Lucy and her comrades in the hidden world of emergency planning. It is from her first-hand experience in the worst moments in recent history that Lucy has become a passionate and thought-provoking voice in the field. She is a treasured advisor to many organisations, including national and local authorities. Her 2022 Sunday Times bestseller, When the Dust Settles, is a profound personal account of an almost philosophical life, one where she has seen and grappled with extraordinary amounts of tragedy, and yet still holds great hope for what our world can be, despite the inevitability of disaster. In her work, she seeks to challenge others to think differently about what comes next after tragic events, and how we look after each other in our recovery. In her own words, she believes that the best emergency response in the long term is done at the local level. And that's why we're so excited to have the opportunity today to sit down with Lucy and dig into the key insights of her incredible career. We'll be focusing on the lessons she holds for local authorities and emergency responders as they prepare for the times of crisis, both now and in the future. So firstly, welcome Lucy, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Before we jump in, I think it's important we just quickly cover what exactly an emergency planner and disaster specialist does. So can you briefly explain for our audience?
Yes, so it's a very broad heading. The way that I tend to describe it, I'm a very, very proud emergency planner. And in the broadest possible way, we think about all the things that can go wrong, make big lists of them, try and plan for them, try and be there with the plans when something goes wrong, try and be there afterwards, and then into that very, very long, slow recovering that you see done at local level. There's lots of different types of emergency planner and lots of different ways we're described. We see people using crisis management, resilience, all of those kind of terms. And you'll find people in the sort of tribe in everything from kind of hospitals and airlines to, of course, what we're talking about today, usually a unit within a local authority.
In your book, you describe the people in these jobs as offering a Cinderella service when the worst happens. So I kind of took from that it could be quite a lonely space where maybe not many people can relate to what you do. Do you find that as a result of that, the sector is quite collaborative, even across borders?
Certainly the last few years, I can't imagine getting through them without my colleagues from across the sector. I think one of the things, it wasn't always lonely, but what it was definitely repetitive. You kept having to explain and sell yourself to leaders in local authority who didn't know who you were. And also the Cinderella service. And I really remember the first Guardian piece that I wrote for the Guardian newspaper was Boxing Day, I think, 2016. And it's because I was so angry at a local news piece that described how rest centres where we send people in emergencies had sprung up after flooding as if they were mushrooms, and that is the toil of hundreds and thousands of Cinderellas working in local authorities and being on call all through Christmas. And I did a piece that said, no, this is what's actually going on behind the scenes. And I think that was a real surprise to people.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it is safe to say that this is a sector that flies under the radar for most people. I mean, when I picked up your book, When the Dust Settles, I was definitely coming into the topic quite naively. I felt for me that it offered a bit of a glass shattering moment. So it was like peering into a parallel world behind the mirror. Do you think many of us are walking into the future quite naively, maybe without enough of an understanding about what the big risks are and how we are, getting ready to mitigate and recover from them?
I think there's a balance. I mean, a lot of the work that I did, so my PhD used something called science and technology studies, which very much looked at sort of how do humans cope with living alongside big risk. And I there's definitely, I'm definitely in the zeitgeist at the moment. There's a number of big newspaper articles the last few weeks that have been like, wake up, everybody. There's all these big risks. And I've just had a Radio 4 series called At Your Own Peril about, like, how do you calibrate these risks? How do you live alongside them? I was naive to the fact people didn't know about emergency planning. So when we were looking to market the book, it's in this genre that they call in the publishing world professional confessional, which sits like the hidden life of a baker or the hidden life of a doctor. And then they went, there's not any other emergency planners. That's the first issue that have done it quite like this. And then secondly, people won't know what you are. So you're going to have to put quite a lot of effort in to even saying it's a thing. And again, the epiphany had come a couple of years before the book, when it was actually 2017, when I wrote again for The Guardian about our response as emergency planners to the Manchester Arena attack. And I wrote a piece about how hard it was to be constantly ready as emergency planners for the future tragedy. And their columnist, Jonathan Friedland, wrote a response piece saying, I just didn't know that this was a thing. And that was the moment when I realized, if you've got, really experienced columnists saying, I didn't know emergency planning was a thing, then we have to talk about this. So that was a really kind of, that was a going above the kind of barricades moment for me.
Yeah, definitely. And we really do need to talk about this. So from our perspective at LGIU, obviously we focus on the local government side of it. And like you say, there's many emergency planners at that level of governance. You yourself, you previously worked at Cambridge City Council in risk management. So speaking from your own experience of working in local government, but also with local authorities over all these years, what is it actually like doing that risk and emergency planning on a local level?
Well, I loved it. And there's definitely a parallel universe where I'm still there. Like, that was my sliding doors, because I would say that was one of the happiest roles I'd ever had. And in fact, I'm back with the crew, from 2004. We're going out for lunch next week. Cambridge City Council was so important in the story, because I think also it's very hard to understand, speak about, get all the different tiers of local government without having been in it. So many things were formed in those years, one of which was things, for example, my attitude to things like how we deal with waste, and the amount a council has to spend on landfill and decisions it has to make about its recycling contractor. And I never looked at what goes on with your council tax in the same way again. And then when it came to things like the pandemic, it was those years with the city council that had really made me think about who does what and what happens when those wheels fall off. So it was hugely important to me. And I'm very protective of the local government sector because of that. I think there is this idea that, more and more so now, with that horrible biases around things like working from home, is what does my council tax pay for? And that was such a brilliant insight into how difficult local government is and how invested actually local people are in their governance. So yeah, I mean, I think that was, gosh, I can't imagine life without that experience, really.
And I think as, someone who sort of observes the sector and supports the sector, I think it almost is its own Cinderella service. And then emergency planning is another layer underneath that. Because, I think the understanding of what local authorities do overall does feel sometimes a little bit undervalued, I think.
Without a doubt.
So can I ask if there are any big misconceptions for emergency planners that people have that we should sort of air out now, Yeah,
get them out of our system. I mean, there's definitely one that I tackle head on in When the Dust Settles, which is, of course, the Skyfall effect, which is the idea that in an event of emergency, some kind of different task force with, probably lots and lots of black Range Rovers and screens that show all the AMPRs, the vehicle recognition, and lots of kind of eyes on London, all this kind of thing, descend. And there's Daniel Craig, obviously. And actually, as you and I know, that's, local government in emergency is the same as local government every day. There's lots of really good hope and people trying to do great things, but we are keeping one eye on the budget. And we're only, I think one of the things that I wanted to capture in When the Dust Settles was sometimes the brilliant mundanity of it. The sort of the tea club, the waiting for people to authorize, but also the camaraderie that comes with that. And I think people have very, very high expectations of emergency planning. And one real moment for me was a couple of years ago doing James O'Brien's Full Disclosure podcast and just talking about, the questions you need to ask are, if your local authority has to, particularly at county level, has to cut its team from 30 people to 2, as it did 2012 onwards, what does that say for emergency planning? And emergency planning really is one of the easiest services to cut. It has one main statute. It has some others as well, but it has the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. Obviously, it also has things like public health legislation. But you can trim it, you can hit it, and nobody really sees it until they need it. And then they say, where did it go? And that has been a huge frustration that we're still all living with in local government emergency planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and obviously this is just the England, UK context where we've obviously seen a trajectory of those cuts over the last decade. And I'll talk more about that because it's definitely an area I want to dig into. But you've also been all around the world to the front line of every type of disaster, I think, imaginable. And you've also studied hundreds of years of historical disasters. So from this sort of global experience, you've become a very big advocate for responders to slow down, be more precautious in their decision-making to avoid causing more harm. And I love this term that you use. It's called the secondary disaster, and how that can, errors in that response can kind of change the course of recovery. So I was wondering if you could offer us some advice on what type of considerations should really be, at the forefront during that initial response to make the difference in the recovery.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant question, and it's so helpful to ask it, because I think this is the value of listening to something like this before you have an emergency. Because one of the things that I've written about a lot is what I call bad help. And bad help probably gets me the most anger on things like social media, because people don't want to be told that their help is causing a secondary disaster. So bad help comes from a place of good, from the heart, but often isn't helpful. So it comes in many forms. For example, one of the big things that I'll rail against is the donation of stuff. My hashtag in the event of the early stages of a disaster, where people are rushing to donate toys and clothes and coats and shoes, is hashtag cash not stuff. And when I first started to talk about this, people would rail back at me that I was sort of crushing their goodness and crushing their spirit. So what's been lovely the last year is I've had a lot more interaction with things like elected members, council leaders in advance about why I'm not just some kind of, terrible Grinch character trying to kill the lovely vibe, but there are real things we do that are harmful. And I use a phrase that I can see people really kind of react to and flinch with, which is, sometimes the initial disaster doesn't do the harm. We do it as responders. And that can be a much wider group of responders. So an example I would give is in a flood. If the local authority decides to divide the affected children up alphabetically and move them to 4 alternative primary schools, they've done the harm to those children. They've not looked at the one school as a lifescape, as a community. They've rushed in. They want to be able to tell the minister that they've solved the problem, and they haven't taken the time, put the kettle on, and thought about what is best for that community. So it's often urging people to take a little bit more time. I'm very, very grateful to the very large number of councils who will bring me in day 3, day 12, and they'll say, this is what we're planning. What do you think about this? And they will, the bravery of those places that then take it from me when I say, this downside of X equals this. And so I think one of the things that's been really, really life-affirming is how people have embraced the idea of the secondary disaster. What you don't want to do is paralyze local authorities. You don't want them to feel like they can't respond without advice, or maybe their decision is wrong. But seeking consultation, I think, on big decisions, reshaping whole communities, what's the best way to donate, and even it's been very poignant to advise in many places, and most recently in somewhere like Southport for Sefton local authority, was things like, when do you take temporary tributes down, temporary memorials? When does a school take down the signage from its front gate? And all I'm ever really doing is I'm a broker to lots and lots of international case studies. And, the Australian Red Cross, for example, had written brilliant guidance for schools, for local responders, on when to manage that and how to communicate that to families and parents. And that's often what you're looking for, is just a little bit of sense making about your decisions.
I think there is something around that sort of immediate response and how you really take the time to almost consider it, but getting ahead before you get involved with making those decisions as well. Like you said, looking to the resources that are already available before just stepping in and trying to make the decision on the spot. Because I think one of the things I picked up on for your book was that one of the biggest challenges seems to be that in the midst of a disaster, there is quite a bit of a communication breakdown potentially, or that can be one of the biggest challenges for local authorities to manage. So one of the examples that you gave was during the 7/7 bombings, that the local authority had recovery spaces ready to go, but the responders instead started directing people to the nearest available spaces. I wonder if there is just a part of an inevitable like panic, fight or flight, human nature to these situations, or is there something more to be done in the preparation to make sure that like sort of the plan goes to plan?
And yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about the kind of current zeitgeist is much more now I'm being asked about what can we talk to communities about? Because if you say to communities in advance, this is where we would like you to go, this is the nominated venues, then they know. Whereas what we tend to see, we saw it with a number of events in the 2000s, as you say, it's a very age-old problem, is people fleeing an incident would go where the lights were on. We've had sort of situations where the police have turned up to say, a hotel where people have gone and they've been given free cups of tea and sandwiches and they're waiting. And the police have said, oh, we've just been told by the local authority you're in the wrong centre. Could we put you on buses to somewhere else down the road? And the hotel said, no, it's fine. We don't need any money. We'll keep the cup of teas coming. No, but that wasn't in the plan. And, at that point, I would probably say, let's flex the plan. But I also think what's nice or what's changed in the last 3 or 4 years is when I first started to publicise the book, there was very, very much more resistance to the idea that the people needed to know this. And now, I'm getting requests to do WI meetings and I'm getting requests to do all sorts of things about citizen preparedness, community preparedness. And one of the big themes in my new writing has very much been around, this is not making people more afraid. It is helping people to place their anxiety somewhere. It is not some generalized anxiety disorder to worry about the state of the world at the moment. That's good sense to have a little bit of a wonder every day what's going on. So being allowed to talk about where we might want people to go. And of course, things like the much greater use now of things like warming spaces, having conversations about where people would go in things like winter is opening up a much wider discussion about these crucial, what we call community-based assets. And that for me is only positive.
I think that was something I picked up on in the book, where you were saying about the scenario reenactments and all the planning sessions. And actually the only people that almost seem excluded from this are the general public. And I do wonder if that's the place that local government steps in, because they are the closest layer of governance to the public. Do they need to take a role in improving that public understanding and readiness? Because it is important, isn't it?
I think the vast majority of the incidents that I've responded to whereas, as you said in the intro, it's always for me a local response is best. And there, often the council was a huge employer of local people. So the local people, I remember once doing some work with Hull, and we were talking about the floods and how they were going to come back from it. And their director, I think it was something like Director of Adults and Children's Social Services, kind of flew in about an hour late. And he was very apologetic. But when we drilled down, he had been flooded too and was now living out of area in like his sister's, back bedroom with his whole family. And what I'm very, very experienced with now is local authorities responding to incidents where their staff are incidents. So probably all of the incidents that I'm dealing with at the moment, there are staff who are both responders and affected community members. That's very profound in Southport. But it was also a very big theme in things like the 2007 floods. Sometimes, and again, this is a bit of a generalization, but the only time I don't find that so much anymore is in London-based incidents, because so many people commute into the centre of London. And that, I think, certainly with Grenfell, there felt like some kind of disconnect. Sometimes, not always. There is a large proportion of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea officers who are based in the borough. But sometimes you encounter incidents where both even the elected members can feel a little bit remote. But what I find, and it does my soul good, is if the elected members are doing their jobs properly as true representatives of the ward, it is as good as the community voice. And actually that's their role in emergency response, I feel, is to fully represent, as you say, that the one group that wasn't in the room for the exercises, doesn't know this is a thing. I'm so passionate at the moment about making sure that the local government guidance to elected members is out, and that they have been briefed on their expectations, both ways. Because for me, they then have to step in and be that voice. I think the other thing is you can see, this is a podcast where hopefully we'll sort of challenge people to think a bit. We see officers bringing existing biases and perceptions to meetings. We see officers who haven't really got to know the particular part that's been damaged by the disaster. So there's work sometimes to do. The other thing that we can be guilty of in local authorities is assuming that because you've got at a table the priest, the imam, the head teacher, you've done community consultation. And you have, how you do consultation is one of the next big challenges, I think, for local authorities, and something they are really struggling with.
Yeah, that actually brings me to my next question, which is around the fact that although they are that very close intertwined link with, like you said, the responders themselves being often residents too, is there that sort of issue where councils are sort of guilty at times of trying to do recovery to communities instead of with them?
Yeah. And that's the first thing that they say it in their rhetoric a lot. We'll be working with you. There's that big, you asked, we did, all of that. And ultimately, they do still struggle with that. Or I think more recently, what I see is a very authentic attempt to completely be guided by residents and communities. But with that can also create a form of paralysis. And one of the things you see local authorities do is lose what I've coined their technical legitimacy. So on things like engineering decisions, planning decisions, what's possible, health, public health, you still need to have a local authority technical legitimacy. You have to have a position on something. So you can't just kind of completely say, the path is open for total redesign. And so there's this middle ground that I think right from things like communications teams and chief execs, they're really struggling with.
That is a really interesting perspective. And I do wonder if there is something around using, community leaders, faith leaders, like you said. Is there something around using them a bit more in that preparation stage?
I mean, I love to do that. And you'll know from When the Dust Settles, there's this rather surreal chapter where I'm training vicars in kind of key issues in what we call disaster victim identification. The more people I feel at a local level that can explain and understand, it's been one of the sort of joys of having the book, talking to chaplains, talking to local faith leaders, health leaders. It is interesting. It exactly goes back to your first question. It's very, very rarely not a revelation. People are like, I did not know any of this existed. As an author, that's lovely. You feel like you've kind of invented Narnia. But as an emergency planner, that's actually quite taken me back in quite a troubling way, because then that says something about all those times when we thought we'd engaged and we told people what was happening and all these kind of things. And so I think the more people we can talk about what's needed, and the more people, as I said before, the more people who understand what's good help and what's bad help, those are the sorts of things that can transform how you respond to a community.
Yeah, that's really, really important. Okay, so I have to ask this question because it just feels, with everything you've experienced, it just feels like you're the right person to ask this to. Has it ever gone exactly to plan? Is that a possible thing to achieve as an emergency planner?
I think 3 years ago we would have said no, but I think there is a consensus in our field as to how effectively what's called Operation London Bridge was deployed by both the national and local authorities. So that is the necessary but very powerful response to the death of a monarch, from the announcement of the death all the way through to the moving of the cortege and the funeral, and all of the constitutional requirements that went with it. And what that taught me was that was one plan that no chief constables or chief executives or fire chiefs could tinker with. It was protected. Everything from the Privy Council, all of the ministers, nobody dared kind of go, actually, we're going to do that a slightly different way. And I don't know that any other plan gets that level of protection. And that taught me something. I have to say, that taught me about the value of the plan itself, because we are very keen in our field to dismiss this A4 piece of paper. It doesn't feel enough. It taught me a lot about the value of the plan, the protection of planning and preparing. And I think it also left me incredibly proud of my fellow planners. You got to see what we do. And that, I think, do you know what? I think that re-galvanized emergency planning in local authorities, because of course it was from the top to the bottom of the country that was engaged, and every part of the country was then visited, by the new king. So there was a lot of work. And I honestly think in terms of morale and mental health, actually, it was that blunt. Emergency planners were so distressed by the pandemic that moment I really saw restore the faith in our field. And so, yeah, I do believe, but there's obviously very specific circumstances there. But what it did re-energize me to do was the value of both the plan and the planning process.
Yeah, like you said, very specific set of circumstances, maybe not one we often will repeat, but it is good. I imagine it felt good to see it,
Very much so.
enacted. Yeah, I think it'd be good to talk a bit more about some of that sort of societal issues around emergency planning, because I think it does overlap with a lot of the things that we're all sort of struggling with in different areas. One of the things that comes across very strongly from your book is that emergency planning is a very male-dominated sector. And you often write about women having the cards stacked against them, being accused of being overreacting, thinking too much, being too emotional. I think this is probably something that a lot of women can relate to in a lot of different fields. Is there something where you think there's a cost to the implications of this gender bias, especially in something like emergency planning?
Absolutely. And again, thank you for the question, because I think it's so important to be able to explore it. And I remember going to one conference, and in response to a question like that, the answer was, well, in something like the fire service now, it's almost 50% equal men and women. And of course, this was before the various studies we've had in the last couple of years. Very, very shocking, but no surprise about things like the culture in a lot of our blue light response organisations. And I would say that the emergency planners, you alluded to this point about where we sit in our tribe and the loneliness of it. And although they often are within local authorities, emergency planners spend a lot of the time with the blue light responders, fire, police, ambulance, coast guard, and others. And so I think one of the big issues there was I've always found local government itself, and we talk back to my Cambridge City days, to be a very welcoming space. But that wasn't where you were spending most of your time in emergency planning. You were spending it with other types of agencies that, for me, were really struggling with. You could be a woman in the service, in the fire or police, but you were expected to conform in certain ways, behave in certain ways, try and find a way to make the kit work for you. Tolerate very high levels of kind of machismo and banter, all of the things that we all know about. And then I think there were other things that I allude to in the book, which is about, having to sort of hide your womanness, essentially, having to sort of keep your health very quiet, because that wasn't expected. That could be anything from sort of chemotherapy and colitis to, as I write about, baby loss and trying to have babies, all of those kind of things. I think for me, it's interesting because the more sort of media and writing that I do, the more I get asked to do things like Young Girls International Women's Day events, and this responsibility becomes very relevant. Like, what do you tell people about the journey? One thing I think women in leadership roles in things like local government have to be really careful of is to not see that they need to repeat the behaviours of the past so that the women today are as resilient as these older women are, this kind of hazing approach to the newer workforce. I don't know about you, but I feel a lot of hope often with the women who came after me, that they're very, very clear on what they want. That there's a new type of communication around requirements and needs. I follow a lot of colleagues in the military who are supporting ensuring a kind of much better path for motherhood and all those kind of things. But they're such fragile rights, aren't they? And I think sometimes, particularly once the book came out, a lot of the men as I'd worked with just had no idea that this was a woman's experience. And that's really powerful, I think. So what were they seeing? Where were, and of course, some colleagues have been great allies, but I think the book certainly created some surprise there.
It's quite telling, isn't it, as well, if it's sort of a revelation to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, what I found quite interesting in your book was that this was advice that you said from older women or women who had been in the career for a while, who said, yeah, it was their direct advice to you about keeping your womanness out of your job. So it is that thing about almost women having to change that narrative as well, about how they hand down that advice. and what advice are they going to hand down next?
Yeah, and I've got this bonkers, I'm really proud of it, bonkers interview that I did for a lovely American colleague who's written a book on intuition and instinct. And I've read what's going into the book. And she's captured me incredibly well. But, one of the things she wanted to explore was intuition, instinct, hysteria, the idea of the Cassandra, which I also explore in the BBC Radio 4 show. And, if you say, I just don't like the way this river gauge is going in this flood situation, something doesn't feel right in my waters, never mind the flood waters, you kind of, what are you then? Are you a bit of a witch? The role of things like instinct. And of course, the kind of ideas of, understanding the gift of fear, understanding, where a situation might go very wrong. One of the things that I've come to really value is that what emergency planning does allow women to do is speak out loud instincts that I think a lot of women have to carry around with them. Like, we get to call it, as female emergency planners, we get to call it a job. And that's been a true gift.
Wow. Yeah, that is really powerful. I think there is something in, as you said, giving that advice and then having to almost laugh it off or take your intuition back because you don't feel as though it will necessarily be respected or seen as anything more than hysteria, which is, quite an insidious issue that we have to keep going to fight towards.
Absolutely.
I think there is another sort of hidden layer and very insidious layer at that within the field as well that you explore. So it's sort of the issues around like the time where your embalmment kits needed to use ground coffees to, represent a broader range of skin colours, to how now, still when planning those scenarios, they're often only built to accommodate a very specific white victim with a surname that you can easily trace, or with cultural and religious practices that are, going to align with the assumptions. So I guess there is something around a proactive step needed to address a lot of these sort of biases. And how can local authorities in particular take those steps now to ensure that there's fair, unbiased treatment of all disaster victims, regardless of race, religion, socioeconomic status, gender? How do we equalise how we treat each other?
And again, I think it's very similar to the question with women. What we're seeing in America is initiatives that we had been very proud of to support with our American colleagues being so easily undone, and that is provoking a lot of interest and concern in emergency management at the moment. After Grenfell, this idea of not understanding, and there was no excuse for it, but not fully understanding the role of race, colour, creed, culture, diaspora, all of these factors. The NHS gave it this term of, in the West London area, gave it this term of cultural incompetency, which would, I sort of got, and it was because it wasn't this sort of overt racism. And in fact, there wasn't even thoughtlessness. People were trying to think about it, but they got it wrong. So they would put in, I remember there was sort of fascinating feedback from a number of the older Muslim women after Grenfell that people kept trying to tap them. And that was for the EMDR therapy, that the therapists were trying to use the tapping therapy. Or, putting in male counsellors to Islamic women faith groups and these kind of things. So I think although it's problematic itself because it does obfuscate the racism in there, it is an issue sometimes of incompetency rather than a kind of deliberate ism in local authorities. And what I felt was really sad in the Grenfell Inquiry report, it was so scant on actual findings really for the local authorities to work with, that I think there's a lot of work to do now to dig deeper than that. And for me, one of the things that the inquiry was a little bit shallow on was it assumed that people had never given any thought to the needs of Muslim survivors of disaster. And of course, there was guidance on, Muslim families will need halal food or they'll need this. What I found in my own experience with both Grenfell and actually earlier disasters that had affected Muslim families was where you saw white secular responders kind of falter was that they didn't understand not the faith, but they didn't understand devoutness. So they assumed that if the person was hungry enough, they'd eat anything. Or if the person couldn't sleep, they'd sleep anywhere. Or if the person couldn't get access to prayer, they wouldn't pray that day. And those are the sorts of things that I'm taking now to local authorities and saying, do your plans understand the faith, not just tell us sort of the basic key tenets of the faith like you would do for sort of religious education GCSE. How deep have you gone in your understanding? And I think that's the next stage of work for local authorities, and nothing must derail this work because it is one of the biggest challenges in our current response is failing to respond to people's needs and to not understanding the needs. And that should not be an issue, 2025, 26. We should be well past that now. So there's work and there's kind of education to do around that, I would say.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. And I mean, you mentioned Grenfell there, and that is something I really wanted to talk to you about today, because obviously, there's been a lot in the news recently around the decision from the UK central government to take down the Grenfell Fire tower block in London. I thought I'd take this opportunity to get your thoughts on it. So back when you wrote the book, you did write a section in there around Grenfell, and you predicted that the tower wouldn't be there for much longer. Is this firstly what you're expecting in terms of the timing? And my second question to you is, how can anyone really gauge when the right time is to put a sort of metaphorical full stop on a disaster? Because you say yourself, people do need an endpoint, but for those involved, it will always feel too soon. So how do decision makers walk that tightrope?
And so we talked at the sort of start of this about giving advice in the early days, avoiding the secondary disaster. And one of the things about seeing lots of responses around the world, every disaster has its own specificities. Every disaster causes its own pain. But what you started to see was some themes that they would share. And we had done quite a lot of work prior to 2017 on the idea of taking an unrested site where the buildings or whatever had already come down or been burnt down to a point of memorial. And we just started to think about what if they're still standing in the way that they have been, say, after the New Zealand Christchurch earthquake, where the cathedral was half up and half down. What does it feel like to have to be part of something that has to be brought down? And we had started to see lots of challenge around the world, and we are incredibly united globally on the things that distress us. So wherever I was studying in the world, this was a particular issue. So I'd actually started to really map this path. And one of the very first things I advised on in the summer of 2017 was that in order to rest the deceased and in order to allow the community to start some kind of healing, and all of that is very problematic as concepts, the tower needed to be rested itself in some form. There are obviously examples of where parts of buildings that have been involved in mass tragedy like this become built into a memorial, but that work needed to happen. And I was increasingly distressed really to see how delayed that had become. But I was also schooled and humbled then to see it become a symbol of dissent, and also, and rebellion, and necessary kind of defiance and rebellion in the face of so much injustice. I think one of the really difficult things is it's become so tied with the idea of the prosecutions, and there's just no real timeline. Because one of the things that sort of, I think, almost fed as an idea to the communities is that the timeline can be kind of predicted on where the police and the CPS will go. But once they bring charges, lawyers can delay. We've seen past examples, 16, 17 years, delay, private prosecutions, judicial review. And what the engineering reports have started to show was that the tower was rapidly deteriorating and was requiring substantial propping. So from a safety and risk point of view, going very much back to that idea of the risk manager in a local authority, one of the ideas was that this had to be communicated to the families. I really saw, as an external person, ministers within the Conservative government really struggle with how to convey that. And I think what the Deputy Prime Minister has done has been very, very clear with what she thinks needs to be done. The problem we have always with disasters is, what is the total pool, that what we call the manifest, of people that you are consulting with? And with Grenfell, it's grown and grown and necessarily grown. I'm the trustee of a children's charity, and we have children who were in utero or not born at the time of the tragedy who now quite rightly consider themselves very active members of the community. So consultation on disaster is a very nebulous thing that very, very rarely achieves coalescence. But what my work had taught me was that, and in the way that I write about it, it is very much an unrested mass grave, that in order to perhaps be able to allow the community to start to heal, something had to be done with the site. And as you say, I was quite explore my position on that in When the Dust Settles. The really sad thing is, I think you're probably seeing a 10 to 20 year path from now as to what that looks like. And in the opening of my new book, I actually look at what's happening in Wrexham, which is again starting a memorial process 90 years after a colliery disaster. So one of the things that, when I go into elected members and leaders in councils I'm talking about is exactly what you're saying, this incredibly lengthy, slow, grinding survivance that comes after disaster. I don't see endpoints, but I do see a value from resting. That's my kind of key word.
In terms of the future, because this is the Future Local Lab, and we do have quite a big focus here on how do we prepare for what's coming down the line. You've seen the emergency planning field change dramatically over 2 decades, thanks to lots of moving parts, things like technology, legislation, resource cuts, and I think, quite frankly, an undermining of emergency planning expertise and experience. So it sounds like from the outside that we're kind of set on a path with very worrying implications for our preparedness for future disasters. Even in the book, you forewarn that we live in a high reliability, high risk world. And with every new technology, we introduce new ways to bring about our destruction. I mean, that is quite the Cassandra statement. How do we mitigate some of that risk? Because it does sound quite terrifying when you put it all into that big picture.
And I think, one very short answer would be, coming on May the 15th is come what may, because this was exactly what you've asked there is exactly the question people would say, what next? How do you live alongside it? And also what I find when I go to book festivals and things is people would want a list of what keeps me awake at night? And, was it nuclear war? Was it nuclear accident? And what was it? And, what will we see? And of course, once you've kind of slightly set yourself up as a partial Cassandra, people want to know what the Cassandra's got to say about it. I think, one of the big themes of all of my work at the moment is if it's your job to mitigate the risk as a risk management officer in a local authority would do, there's absolutely work to be done. If that's not your experience, if you're something else, then you absolutely have to learn how to live alongside it and not kind of, as John Law says in his writing, we couldn't get up out of bed and put the kettle on and make a cup of tea every day if all we thought about was how safe is that local nuclear power plant. We have to be able to live alongside it. And that's a big theme for me. I think, on a very practical level, there's a lot of criticism, for example, of local authority community risk registers. They're very partial in their information. There's very little money to do this at the moment, but if I'm a local authority, I'm very interested in things like what's on your website. What are you telling people is most useful? One of the most useful phrases to use with your citizens at the moment can be quite counterintuitive, and it's these 3 words: help isn't coming. What do you want citizens to do in the event of major incident that will give you time to respond where it's needed? So we are behind many other countries in terms of our community and citizen readiness. So that would be the biggest thing I would ask local governments to be focusing on. Looking at international examples, it's very important to work with communities that they're more resilient and also that we're honest with communities. So a lot of local authority web pages say things like, in the event of a power cut, make sure you're on your power company's priority services register. It's a good thing to be on, but it offers you very little in the way of support and help. So one thing when I'm working with elected members at the moment is I'm really getting them to drill down on what actually does work and what's on offer. So I think work with what emergency planners love to work with, the reasonable worst case scenario. I love it when I get sort of press inquiries from things like the Daily Star, because it's always like, is Britain ready for zombie attack? Is Britain ready for alien attack? And my answer is always the same. Emergency planners are not that obsessed with the scenario. We work to some core consequences, whether it's nuclear winter or attack of the Yetis. We work with a set of core consequences, and all of those will fall on the local authority to respond to. And the big question now, we've got so many local authorities, and I know they're worried about money and they're worried about resource, but this would be where to focus attention because it would strengthen the rest of the core of the organisation.
You spoke there about sort of how we're behind our international counterparts. So I just wonder, who is doing it well? If for our audience in local authorities, who can they look to that maybe could set a bit of a standard to follow?
Well, everywhere tends to go on a carousel of tough times. Like, as I say, the UK are looking at our US friends. We had FEMA envy a few months ago. Now that looks like it won't exist anymore. We would put up Australia and New Zealand as very good examples before the pandemic, but we all struggled together. And what a lot of questions in the pandemic would come to me about who's doing well. And that's not really how global disaster works. Everybody takes their turn on the carousel of kind of difficult times. We're often given examples, and rightly so. We learn a lot from other places like Japan with community preparedness, but they have a very different structure and a very different way that society works. And the other thing that sometimes I have to say I love about British emergency planning, I love the rebellion. I mean, that's a big theme in the new book. I love the mischief. I love the people writing to their councillors. I love the kind of angry letters to local elected members that say, this is what you should have done. Let's continue to live in a place where there is defiance, there is asking the difficult questions of our elected peoples, there is challenge. So sometimes the places that we're told to put up as examples are actually not as free and as exciting, I don't think, as we are to emergency planning. So I slightly swerve that question, but I'm always borrowing from other places. So the Swedens, the Finlands, the Denmarks for things like their winter readiness, Australia and New Zealand, I'm constantly stealing their recovery tools. I'm all about my kind of international copy and pasting.
And I feel like that's something the sector should do as a large, that there should be that looking internationally and copy and pasting where appropriate or where useful.
Completely. Even down to, there's nothing greater than when a colleague in sort of Finland will say, would you like a copy of my prepper bag that we've just put out to our local people, what to have in your go bag? Send it over here. We love that. And that's this service that I try to offer in the immediate aftermath is saying, look, this is what people put in their leaflet for this kind of event, or this is what we found work with children in America. So I was just asked for a journalist piece about children's resilience with sort of international examples. And it's a great joy of mine, and maybe a form of kind of sense making of the mad world to gather these examples.
Yeah. There's something in your book that I actually found very poignant, and a chapter that wasn't necessarily an emergency that you dealt with, but it was around the Alton Towers incident, the Smiler roller coaster crash, where you sort of spoke about the degrading of a safety culture. And I wonder if that's something that we're tackling right now, and maybe we'll continue to tackle into the future. Are we all going through a bit of a degrading of a safety culture? And is that something that local authorities need to sort of step in to reinstall that and make sure that communities are looking after each other, that we're sort of seeing the value of that?
I think there was a real concern after the pandemic that what you would see, and even at one of my own children's school meetings this week, I used the phrase after the pandemic. You see people slightly bristle that, oh, we're still talking about that. This is a massive global disaster with huge consequences. And one of the things that we knew it would do was kind of erode, it would fatigue, and actually what I championed and continue to champion via my social media all the way through the pandemic was how well the local governments held things together. But that fraying that you refer to is exactly what we're seeing now. So the more potholes, the more litter, the old COVID signage, nobody's got any money, the problems in schools, everything starts to feel very frayed, very tired, very fatigued. One of the things that you can't do is let that set it. You have to keep up the energy. You have to keep the momentum. And a lot of local authority leaders are saying to me, how do I say to staff, we go again? Even if you are ill, even if you are exhausted, even if you are coming to work with post-viral diseases, because we knew this was going to be a kind of consequence of a nasty pandemic, all of these things. And that's incredibly difficult. And it links to your last question. There has to be a point to all this. And one of the things that it's been a joy to work with some local councils during the pandemic who've kept a very child and young person focused lens. So looking at every project through a 20, 30-year child and young person's lens. And that's the difference between very short-termism, the 4-year political cycle, and policies that I think will endure, is saying, what does this do to the local area? What does this build back? After disaster, you have to see more nature, you have to get out. But also there's questions back to the public, the amount of things like antisocial behaviour and littering and things. We have to also agree again. We had the social contract broken with us in the pandemic, not by local government, but by national government. And that has to be reset. And where we tend to take that out as a public is on our local people, our local area, our local elected members. And there's no doubt the next few years will be tumultuous because of that.
Absolutely. Speaking of the pandemic, because obviously that is the disaster that we have all survived, as you explained, we are all disaster survivors now. I think there is something around that loss after loss that not just through the death toll, but obviously through the way that we sort of dissolved the fabrics of our society and trying to build that back. But you also still hold a very optimistic view, I think, around sort of where recovery will take us in the years to come. Things will get worse before they get better, but eventually we'll emerge stronger and kinder. What do you think now? Where are we at on that sort of ambitious timeline, I guess? Are we getting closer to that?
And I think, one of the things we joked about, the kind of women's intuition and when to keep it quiet and when it's going to get squashed. And I haven't been wrong yet in terms of the things we thought we would see, and there's even that very prophetic line, which, I think because of the time I was writing the book, we were still very early on in the pandemic, 2021. And I wrote that line, after pandemics, we expect to see pogroms and riots. And that has become so true. And in the new book, I reflect that the timeline for that, when I was asked about it by government, was about 4 to 5 years. That would be a real low point for, as you say, the fabric. That would be the real point at which it was tested. And we're getting some things wrong. We're alienating more and more people within society. We're labeling more and more people within society. The way that humans have always lived is kind of inside the gaps and with hope in the moments that they're in. I think what we'll see is a kind of resetting, a recalibration about the kind of peril that we're always in. When you live your life in disaster, you realize we're in peril all the time, but there's lots of living to be done in the gaps and in the moments between. That's the big realization for this next stage of life. There will be, I hope, and I think I already see it, a lot more compassion sometimes. There's a lot, what's been interesting, as I say, I've got another book coming out this year, and I'm alongside, you sort of learn who your book festival chums are going to be, and I'm alongside a lot of writing on things like beliefism, kind of arguing with people you don't necessarily want to agree with, but reaching collaboration, the role of hope, the role of resilience. And that, what I've learned, and I would say this because I write books, but what I've learned about publishing is it's a great way, it's like sort of great way of being 2 years ahead. And they knew this year was going to be hard and people would need things to think about and get them through. And then you start to see a very, very gentle rebuild. And what gives me hope is never like the big world picture. It's always the little moments of joy and going to see my Cambridge local authority pals and all of those kind of things. Those are the joys.
Yeah, the everyday, the community.
Every day. And the communities do wonderful things. And you'll know from my writing, and it's big in my new writing, I don't buy into the heroic phase. I don't want everybody wearing, I heart name of random village t-shirts if they don't feel it. I want authentic community response. And I have to say that's been a lot of what I've seen in places like Southport. I didn't know that I would see it so soon. We're back to very authentic, not nudged, not forced community response, where the responders are weighing up, will what we do now harm in 2 or 3 years' time? And it has been a privilege to see that in the worst of circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, my last question. I know I've asked quite a lot so far, but if you can give me one more. So reflecting on all you've seen and all that you've learned about local community resilience and collaboration in disaster recovery, what key piece of advice would you share with local leaders as they grapple with the impact of these big global challenges on their communities?
Well, it's a very easy one because it's learn to love the disaster recovery graph, learn to love the initial honeymoon phase, learn to understand what the slump does to your community, learn to think about, this whole podcast has been about, whether you see an uptick, what can harm, what can help. Most importantly, the other thing about the New Zealand disaster recovery graph, which I draw on a lot, and we'll make sure people have got a link to, is it's encased within this wonderful New Zealand Red Cross guidance called Leading in Disaster Recovery, a companion through the chaos. And a big chunk of that is about keeping your own head above water. It doesn't mean leaders in the sense of political leadership. It means anybody who carries a lantern, as anybody in working local authority does. If you choose to work in local authority, you are saying to people around you, I'm there, I'm here, whatever role that is, from waste management, schools, street cleaning, risk management, finance, whatever role that is, you are lantern bearing for your community. And this is a guidance document for you about looking after yourself, about when to remember it's just a job, which is a really difficult thing to say. A lot of people aren't in public sector for the glamour and the money.
Surprise!
They're suffering from this terrible disease called vocational awe, which means they got into it because they want to make a difference, which is great, but it means they're empaths. It means they're highly prone to burnout, and they start to question their own sense of self when it's linked to their job. So one of the things we really have to do is take care of our local government colleagues. And that is something that's my next couple of years with Come What May, is all about taking care of the wonderful people who get us through.
Amazing. That is a perfect way to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Lucy, for spending your time talking to us and sharing your honestly truly incredible insights into this topic area. So for all our LGIU members who are left wanting more, you're in luck, because Lucy will be back with us on Wednesday, the 9th of April at 10 a.m. to host an exclusive Ask the Expert session. So this is an amazing opportunity for you to ask Lucy your very own questions, and you can go to lgiu.org to book your place. And for everyone else, as we've mentioned, Lucy is the gift that keeps giving, because she is about to release a new book, Come What May, Life-Changing Lessons for Coping with Crisis. And this is out on the 15th of May, and you can pre-order it right now on Amazon. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you again, Lucy, for joining us. We'll be back soon with more interviews with leading experts for the Future Local Lab.